What's going on, guys? So I have yet another parts review for you today. I've really been cranking these videos out lately, and I am thoroughly enjoying them because I love giving you my perspective, my opinions, and my experience with these various parts. Because hopefully, number one, I hope you are able to use that as a data point when it comes to buying your car parts. Whether you buy this part or buy a different part is totally up to you. I'm not trying to persuade you to buy this or dissuade you from buying it. I'm simply trying to put out some information, give you my story, my experience with this part, so that you are able to make a more informed decision. And number two, as I've stated previously, I will never review a part that I have not used extensively. I do not believe in that at all. I think it's very important to have these parts installed for some time on your car before giving a complete review on them, because a lot of times parts develop issues over time. So if you just install something brand new, you know, you're not going to have all the issues with it that you might have even a year later or 2 years later. So this majestic octopus looking thing in front of me is none other than the GrimmSpeed Air Oil Sperator 3000. So it's actually not 3000 anything, it's just the incredibly boring GrimmSpeed Air Oil Sperator. But they definitely should have named it the 3000 because that'd be way more badass. Now, before I get into the specs and the price and all that good stuff, I briefly want to touch on what an air oil separator is and why you would want one. I will be making a more in-depth video in the future on this system, but the basics are this. Every engine has crankcase pressure, has pressure in the heads, and you have oil vapor in that. And all of that has to vent somewhere. According to the federal government, it has to be routed back into the intake to be burned through the engine a second time, along with the air and fuel and everything else, because of emissions. Leave it to the federal government to screw stuff up, right? Now, the reason that is bad is because oil vapor does not burn, okay? It will drastically reduce your octane. Obviously, it depends on how you're driving, but it can reduce your octane level, and it can cause knock and engine damage. And even if you're not driving hard or it doesn't cause knock, if it's not that bad to that level, it will speed up the carbon deposits in your engine, on your pistons, and on your valves dramatically. So in Subarus, it's particularly bad, and it coats your entire intake track in oil. If you've ever removed the top mount intercooler or even the intake, you can see some of that stuff. That's what an air oil separator does. It separates the oil vapor out of that air that's carrying it, and it's supposed to drain the oil back into your oil pan while that air continues through your intake, and you know, you don't have to worry about knock, you don't have to worry about the carbon deposits in your engine. But that's what this contraption here is. So this part was installed by myself back in 2012. I remember because I wanted one ever since I bought my Subaru, and it took me forever to save up for this part, and I was so excited when I finally got it. But I installed this myself back in 2012. It was just uninstalled like 2 months ago or so, say May 2019. Overall, it was a decent part. I didn't have too many issues with it. So as far as difficulty goes, I have to give it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. It is not incredibly difficult, but it is a pain in the butt. Now, mind you, I installed mine back in 2012. They very well may have changed the instructions since then, but the instructions I got were not great. They were written okay, but the pictures they included were very hard to see what was going on, and they were black and white. I believe they have ones posted online now, but I don't believe they had those back when I installed mine, so hopefully that has changed. When it comes to the specs, it's a pretty simple part. There's not a whole lot of specifications on this. It is aluminum. The inside here is what actually allows the oil vapor to separate from the air. And you have these 3 hoses. They come into this chamber, swirls around, the oil will drop down your oil fill neck, and the air will go to where the air needs to go. It actually connects back to your intake, to the turbo inlet hose, and will route back through the intake that way. This does mount, if you've never seen one, this does mount in place of your oil cap, which is another problem. I'll talk about that in a minute. But overall, pretty good construction. I haven't had anything break on it, so it is robust. All the seals on it are good. They have rubber O-rings, and I Haven't had any issues with any of those. They also use this 1/2-inch inner diameter heater hose or fuel line. Haven't really had any issues with that. It does require that you reuse some of your OEM hoses. Not crazy about that, but it is what it is. They also have these plastic fittings and connectors, which I have never had an issue with. They are very strong and robust, and none have broken on me. So overall, it's constructed very well. I don't know what else to say about specs. You know, usually parts have more specs, but this is basically what it is. You see it right here. Aluminum construction, rubber hoses. They do not include these clamps, but I recommend that. Price is not so good. Price, right now I'm looking at Rally Sport Direct, and I try to sample some other sites. I know Import Image is usually a little bit cheaper. There may be other sites that you use. You could probably find this part on Throttle and some other sites, but on Rally Sport Direct it is $299. Call it $300 because let's be real, it's $300 bucks. $300 for this. It's what you're going to spend basically on an air oil separator. There are some that are cheaper. There are a lot that are a little bit more expensive, such as the IAG model that I got. However, I'll talk about this in value. I think the price is a little bit high for the performance, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But you're going to pay probably $300 unless you get it cheaper somewhere else. So let's talk about pros. The number one pro is honestly the whole reason of even installing an air oil separator. The pro is that it does separate the oil from the air going into your intake. It does it pretty well, could do it better. I'll touch on that more in cons and further in this video, but it does work. It's better than nothing. I will say that. It's better than nothing. It works, and it does mostly what it's supposed to do. The other pro that I would say is it's fairly compact. The IAG air oil separator, I believe Moroso makes one, Crawford makes one, Cosworth may have made one. I know Radium Auto makes one. Everybody makes air oil separators these days. This is an older design. In fact, this is one of the first designs for air oil separators for Subarus. At the time, I believe the only other one out was Crawford. The pro to this is that it's actually a compact design. So on those other designs that I just mentioned, most of them need to be mounted somewhere. They are like a physical can, and they need to be mounted by the strut, or they need to be mounted on a pitch stop mount if you have a front mount intercooler or something. They are significantly larger than this. This design here actually uses your oil feed neck as the can, if you will, and it uses that to just separate the oil and drain it back to your oil pan. There are pros and cons to that. So that's kind of cool that it's a slim, sleek design. Yes, you do have hoses running across your engine bay, but you kind of have that with any AOS that I've seen. So next, let's talk about cons. And this is where things get interesting, because the biggest issue that I have with this design, one of the most annoying things about this design, is actually one of the pros that I just mentioned, and that is the way that it mounts on the oil filler cap. So, like I said, you have your oil feed neck right here, it rounds down to the engine, and that is very innovative. The thing that I don't like about that is you cannot add oil easily or quickly anymore. And you need to break out a socket set to add some oil. So there have been times, I have to admit, I'm not proud of it, but there have been times where I've checked my oil and I was a little bit low. And I said, screw it, I'm going to go to the store, I'll fill it when I get back, I'll fill it tomorrow, whenever, because I did not want to deal with it. You cannot just twist off a cap anymore. Nope, you need to go and get your socket set out. I believe this uses a 17 millimeter, but that's off the top of my head. I haven't used this in a while. But you have to go find the right socket, find a wrench, and twist this center core out so that you could add oil, because this, like I said, goes right to your oil feed neck. It's not the end of the world, but it's one of those things that you kind of have to be mindful of. But the biggest pet peeve is needing a wrench to add oil. And there have been times where I'm out somewhere and I just don't have a wrench with me. And that is a huge pain in the ass. If you have an adjustable wrench or a crescent wrench or something like that, yes, that will work. You don't need a socket set, but you need a 17 millimeter something to turn this so that you could add your oil. So that is a huge con in my opinion. Can't tell you how many times I've dreaded adding oil to my car. Something that should be super simple. Just twist a cap, pour some oil in, put it back, and you have to go get a wrench and it becomes a whole affair. So that is the most annoying thing with this design. One of the other cons that I have with this design, which I touched on earlier, is that you have to reuse some of your OEM hoses. Now, if you're installing this, I'm not worried about saving my OEM hose. It's not that I can't cut it. I don't care. The issue that I ran into is I installed this in 2012. My car was built in late 2005, call it 2006. So my hoses were 6 years old at that point. So I buy this, I'm ready to install it, and there were a couple hoses that I had issues with because, as you may know, as rubber degrades, it either gets brittle and dry rots and cracks, or it gets hard as a rock. And this hose right here is a good example of that. I really cannot squeeze this. It's almost like a plastic. So there were some hoses on my car that they wanted me to, cut and twist and route into this. And because the plastic was old and hardened, it would not stretch over these plastic fittings here. So I understand why they do it. It's easier for them to just save some money. The hoses are already routed there. I don't really take an issue with that. I'm not trying to say that they're cheap or anything like that. I see why they do it. It's a smart move on their part. However, if you do have an older car, and this really only applies to older cars. If you have a new car, it's probably not a problem. But for me, in my case, it really sucked to try and get this installed, only to find out that I had to replace some hoses after I was halfway through this install. So it seems like a good idea, but at the same time, it does cause some issues. So if you do have an older car and you know your hoses are old, you might want to pick up some extra half-inch fuel line or heater hose. Another issue that I've had with this is in colder climates particularly, condensation tends to form on the inside of these lines. And what happens is that condensation, that moisture mixes with the oil and you get what's called milkshake. And it's this light brown oil substance. And I've only noticed it on the inside here. I don't know how much of that is going into my oil pan. I don't know how much of that is going into my intake. But it's not something that you want to see on, the inside of your air oil separator. Some other designs, like the one from IAG and some others, actually route coolant lines through the body of the air oil separator so that coolant actually heats up the whole body, and it will help evaporate any condensation and prevent it from forming so that you don't have water mixing with your oil and going either into your intake or back into your oil pan. And we have one more con that I want to touch on. It seems like there's a lot of cons with this part, and that's kind of because there are, but I don't know. They're small, they're not major, but they are things to be addressed. And that is these hoses here. So if you look at the body itself, I'll probably drop in a stock photo so you can see, but it has these little metal fittings on it, and these hoses slide over that. In the kit, they do not include metal worm clamps like I have here. They only give you zip ties. Well, let me tell you something about zip ties. And I'm not trying to fault GrimmSpeed, because GrimmSpeed does it, IAG does it. There are countless other companies that do it too. I get it. Zip ties are literally pennies instead of, a bunch of pennies for nice hose clamps. But the problem with zip ties is this. Number one, they're plastic. Even if you use pliers to really crank down on them, they could only squeeze so tight because they're plastic zip ties. The second issue with zip ties is as they heat up, as anything heats up, they expand, right? Well, when they expand, then you lose any gripping power that had. So even though these fittings have barbs on them, with zip ties on them, they do not seal properly. And this is one of the areas that I had a leak that was discovered by AV Tuning. I had a bunch of leaks on my car. Most of it was due to old lines and old hoses. But they put a smoke machine on my car, and they had a bunch of smoke coming out from here. So they added these worm clamps for me, and that's really what it requires to get a good seal. Around the plastic fittings here, I haven't really noticed any problems with them. Most of them fit without needing any type of clamp. I would recommend at the very least zip ties. I haven't noticed an issue with these parts sealing, but the metal barbs on this body itself definitely need clamps. So we are getting into the home stretch of this review, but if you're still tuned in at this point, I want to give you a huge personal thank you from me to you, because you are really helping my channel grow, and you are showing a ton of support by watching, because YouTube's algorithm actually picks up on how long people watch, and the longer you watch, the more that helps me, the more they recommend my videos to other viewers. So with that being said, does this part require a tune? No, it does not. And the reason it does not is because all of these lines are sealed, right? They're all plumbed into a fitting or something, so there's no loose ends. Next on my list is value, and to determine value, you have to consider how much you paid for it and whether or not it does what it promised that it would do. So I have to rate this part a solid 3 stars. Middle of the road, average review for an average part. I'm sorry, it works. It doesn't do anything exceptional, but it doesn't exactly suck either. So first of all, let's touch on price. It is a little bit cheaper than some other brands. However, for the performance, I don't think it's that great of a value. Me personally, I would just rather spend an extra $100 and go with a different design that is much bigger, like the IAG is a good example. Much bigger, has more room to separate those oil vapors from the air. They just work better. They're more effective. I understand that for a lot of people, an air oil separator is not a critical part. I believe it should be. Honestly, I think an air oil separator should be one of the first parts that you get, especially if you have a Subaru. But I understand $300 is a lot of money. I'm not saying it isn't. But me personally, I would rather save up an extra $50, an extra $80, an extra $100, and go with a different design. So would I recommend this part? Honestly, if you could get it for a good price. So this is similar to my Mishimoto review. If you could get it for a good price, go for it. I will be selling this. I am not selling it for brand new price. It is in great condition, honestly, and it will still function the same. So I will be selling this much lower than the retail price, but I would not pay, if I could do things over again, I would not pay $300 for this particular design, especially today, since there are so many other amazing options out there. So I can't say I wouldn't recommend it, but I would not recommend it for $300. If you could score one for $100 or even $150, that's not bad. And it's not nearly as bad if you live in a warmer climate where you don't have freezing cold temperatures. I would recommend it, but not at full price at all. And lastly, this part does not require any supporting mods. In fact, I would say that this itself is a supporting mod, especially if you are going for a tune or you're going to upgrade your turbo or something along those lines. So I know this review is probably a little bit critical of it. I'm just trying to be fair, okay? And honestly, it did underperform, in my opinion, for the money spent. However, it is better than stock, in my opinion. So I would go with this over nothing. So that wraps up this part review. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see more part reviews, let me know in the comments down below. If you have a particular part that you want to see me review, be sure to check out my Wheelwell page. I have all my mods listed there. So pick out any of those parts that are currently installed on my car or that were previously installed on my car, and I will do my best to review it if I think there's some demand for it, because I enjoy reviewing parts and I enjoy giving you guys information so that you can make a more informed decision when it comes to buying car parts, because I'll tell you, there was not a whole lot of information out there when I bought some of these parts. But if I could pass on that information to you guys and make it easier for you guys, then that's going to make me happy. That's what I'm all about. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. This right here, this majestic piece of octopus leg in front of me, that doesn't make sense.